backstage producer, Bradford Lewis. Please, Bradford. Producer, Bonnie Arnold. And we have Astrid in the house. Ladies and gentlemen, America Ferrera. And How to Train Your Dragon, The Hidden World, and the trilogy's director, writer, and executive producer, ladies and gentlemen, Dean DeBlois. How are y'all?
Good.
Very well.
So good we can't talk about it.
Well, so let's go back to and this is an open question for everyone. Let's go back to the beginning, because DreamWorks, after Jeffrey left and Universal was taking it, there was a little bit of a pause there, and this was a really important film to get off the ground. Tell me about the development. How did it change story-wise, and where did it go?
You mean from before? You mean from the very beginning of between 2 and 3?
From the very beginning.
So I think when we started work on the third part, we had already decided we were doing a trilogy. So we had in mind a sense of where it was going to end, and that was inspired by a conversation with Cressida Cowell back on the first movie. And she told me that she was working on the final installment of her book series, and she was going to explain what happened to dragons and why they aren't here anymore. And I thought that was really emotional and gripping and mysterious. And even though the narratives are quite different from the books to the movies, I thought that would be a really cool ambition to take on as part of a trilogy, a 3-act story that would track the growth of our characters. So we had that in mind, and I think when DreamWorks was sold to Comcast and Universal became now our parent studio, and we were now answering to Donna Langley and her crew, I met with them very early on, and I told them about our aspirations for the third movie and how it was going to have this kind of bittersweet end to it. And it was modeled in some way after one of our favorite films, which was Born Free. And Donna said, "Oh my God, I grew up with that movie. I love it." So from the moment I walked out of that office, I felt like we had their support, and we were able to keep, pursuing this movie, even with its little changes of character arcs along the way. It was mostly, that was the goal, and it wasn't compromised.
And so Born Free was the film you paid homage to throughout?
Well, it's a mix. Like we have, the first movie has moments that are an homage to Black Stallion, that beautiful Caleb Deschanel photography of the moment where the boy and the horse, now marooned on the island, come to befriend one another, and that touch and go trust that is built. And we've had moments that we've paid homage to Star Wars and all sorts of films along the way. But I think for this movie, the idea that there would be a parting of ways, that there would be a reintroduction to the wild for Toothless, and a sense of revisiting them years later, as we saw at the end of the movie here, where they go back and they realize, wow, they thrived. They thrived, and despite our fears, they had a family of their own, and Hiccup and Astrid had a family of their own, and so it was the right decision, and that's something that was done in Born Free that I always thought was really meaningful.
Then there was that. Remember, there was also this famous story, and it was on YouTube or video or whatever, of the guy who had another lion.
Christian and the Lion.
Yeah, and we were watching that endlessly. How he raised the baby lion, let him go, went back years later, and the lion recognized him when he went back. And we watched that a few times. We always thought that was very poignant, really, and a way to end the movie, the trilogy, really.
Now bringing Stoick back and the timelines. Tell us about that. That was also very important. I understand.
Yes, it was. I mean, and I had told Gerard Butler on the second film, as he was reading the script and realizing his character was going to die. Again, he says his characters always die, but I said no. It's really important that we'll bring him back, because he, I lost my father when I was 19, and all of a sudden, all those moments that seemed sort of trivial or unimportant come back, and they have these truths in them, and they have these sort of moments of guidance and wisdom that come to inform your decisions going forward. So Hiccup had to step into the role of chief in the second movie, and having Stoick sacrifice himself to enable that made that decision a very strong and very cemented one. But the idea that he would now, as a rookie chief, have to go back and not have to go back, just sort of have his memories drift back and remember moments with his father that had these kernels of wisdom and warmth in them. And a different shade of Stoic than we would have known. He wasn't always that sort of harsh taskmaster. He actually had a vulnerability to him and a softness that would have been shown in those early years. It's something we wanted to bring to light, both as kind of a warm hug from the past to have Stoic back in the story, but also to show that Hiccup's really, searching himself to find how to go forward as a leader.
America, tell us about Astrid in this. She goes from, we see her originally as a teenager. Now she's a formidable partner. You have this gorgeous speech that you give to Hiccup about, how, he always kept you strong. Tell us about her arc, and then how does it, take us a little bit into the process. Is there a table read with most of the voiceovers ahead of time? Or is it really like you just show up in the day and they put pages in front of you and you just go in a booth?
Yeah, it's been a real process. I think my first recording for How to Train Your Dragon ever was almost 12 years ago. Which is, it's amazing. I mean, it's the longest I've ever been with any character. And
We were all just out of high school.
I knew that I'd have multiple children before this was over, and it's come true. I'm pregnant with my second, so. It's been such a journey. Bonnie's been there from the beginning, and Bonnie was actually a real champion for the character of Astrid. Because there was a girl in the book series, but she was very different and very sort of like I don't like can't find words. She was like that. You get me. And so Astrid was really a concoction of the earlier conversations about wanting and needing a female character that could be a part of the action and be important to the story. And so I'm so grateful to Bonnie and the others who created her, because I could very easily see a world in which a movie, what was focused on adventure and Hiccup and Toothless, and there could very easily not be that representation of a young woman who has a real agency in the story. So that was wonderful. When I first started, it was before Dean and Chris, who was the co-director on the first film, were even attached. And my first recording session was, what I remember about my recording session is just like a series of yelling and grunting. Like I didn't really know who Astrid was, and I think we were all finding it together. And then when Chris and Dean came on, everything really started to take shape, and it's been such a surprise and such an incredible gift as the years have gone on and as the stories have developed to get to be in collaboration with Dean, in conversation with him, with Dean and Bonnie, talking about like what was possible for the Astrid character, what was possible for Astrid and Hiccup's relationship, what hadn't we seen in a animated trilogy about the growing up relationship between two people who go from being real foils to one another, to depending on each other and needing each other and keeping their relationship more complex than just a romantic one where they truly grew up together and found who they were together. And all of that came out of conversation. And this is as powerful and as cinematic of storytelling that I've ever been lucky enough to be a part of in anything I've ever done. And I could listen to Dean talk all the time about everything is rooted in something. Like just the idea, like there's no question you can ask about the last three films that aren't deeply thought about and deeply rooted in an emotional truth and in an emotional goal. And to get to have that on any job is like a miracle, but to get to have that over the course of 12 years with a creative leader like Dean, who is such a masterful storyteller, and I don't think he knows how to write a story that isn't deeply rooted moment to moment in something so much more meaningful with so many layers than what you would come to expect in an animated trilogy. So it's been such a journey, and it has grown, and I feel so grateful and lucky that I got to be Astrid, and frankly that Astrid exists in the world, because I've been approached by so many families, so many parents, so many young boys and girls who have been really inspired by her.
And Astrid's a case of once we got to know America, we really were able to funnel a lot of her qualities into the character. You know, she's very strong, she's outspoken, she is passionate, and she's competitive, and those were characters
What
that
are you talking about?
we realized that in reconfiguring the story that we wanted to tell the tale of the first Viking to take a chance on the enemy and befriend a dragon, whereas they were taught to kill them. And Astrid represented the first to change, the first convert. And so we had to make her tough. She had to be the ideal next generation Viking. She was so capable. She was a natural leader. She was athletic, strong, like the star player of the young generation. So if Hiccup could persuade her, to take pause and get to know the dragon and start to see another side of the conflict, then he might have a chance with everyone else. So she represented that key pivot point from the start. And then, she became the first to believe in that way of life and to support Hiccup even against all of his detractors. Going forward in the story, she becomes a very natural and a very strong conscience for Hiccup and advisor. And what eventually happens is that even in this movie, as you've seen, Toothless becomes awakened to another destiny, one without Hiccup. What sort of naturally and sort of softly takes form is that he comes to realize that his true partner all along was Astrid. And so it gives a promising future in both sides of the equation.
I just want to say, I think you asked another thing, and I just want to say that it's interesting how, for me, Jay in America, Jay Baruchel, who voices the Hiccup voice in America, I just can't even imagine who those characters are without Jay in America. I mean, they've just become those characters, and I feel like, and I think Dean and Brad would agree, that they sort of know those characters, they know those characters the best, and they can come in and I know Dean had lots of conversations with the two of them about how would Hiccup be in certain situations as the process progressed. And I think they had a great sense of who they were.
Yeah, actually, Anthony, in answer to the other part of your question, I would share early drafts with specifically Jay in America because I knew I could trust their feedback, and they had such a strong sense of what the tone of the whole enterprise was, and specifically their characters, which are the key characters of the whole saga. So early drafts would go out to Jay in America to take their feedback, make adjustments, and then when it would come to recording sessions, I would have the dialogue written out in the scenes, but I'd always invite them to consider it, think about it, if something feels better flowing off the tongue, or if you have a different opinion on how the character would react in that scenario, let's adjust and try that and explore it.
And Dean didn't really have to, in the case of America and Jay, he didn't really have to offer that because really they own the characters. I mean, there's ways where it's impressive to watch America when she records. She actually talks about the intention of the line and really what are we going for? What's this moment about? And she will change a phrase or two. Her and Dean sort of triangulate on the point, and then it comes out very differently. Jay hunches over with his McDonald's by him and goes, "Nah, I don't know if he'd say it that way, Dean."
The other thing that is just absolutely gorgeous in this film, and I remember seeing a very early clip, and I mentioned this, and you have just kept it up, is the elements, the earthly elements, the sand, the ferns, the metal, everything gorgeous, lifelike. Tell me about the evolution of the technology since the first film, and also sorry for the part B of the question, but there's a whole thing where you know, when you're doing a cartoon, you don't want it to look too human-like. You still want to leave it, for a certain reason, you know, looking like a cartoon. Tell us more about that. Tell us about, because, I mean, that, like, when the tail just goes over the ferns, I'm just like, wow, that's amazing. That's just amazing.
Well, that's been wonderful for us as well. Like, over the course of the 10 years of making these movies, the technology would improve every year. And they would come to us and say, okay, now we can do snow. Whereas 2 years, we wouldn't have attempted it. It used to be things like cloud and water and amorphous things that had to interact with hard objects, be it a ship or a person. That was super, super difficult. Fire and explosions were actually kind of easy. But it just kept evolving. And the other movies that were being produced at DreamWorks all had their wish list of things they wanted to do. They might have a really furry character that had to interact with hard things, and so they would solve that problem, and then we got the benefit of it. And we would do the same for them. So it's this expanding toolbox as we go. But yeah, sure, in the beginning we had to avoid things like characters walking through tall grass or ferns, or it would have broken the box. All of our computers would have shut down trying to render it. But in this movie, we were able to bring the environment alive. So even in a conversation with, say, Hiccup and Astrid standing on the cliff, and she's trying to inspire him to do something about the problem. In the background, out of focus, you see all of the grass sort of blowing in ribbons across the environment, or leaves rustling in trees, and that's just something that it's subtle and almost imperceptible, but it just brings the world alive, and we're finally able to do that. So much so that we can actually say at this moment in time, there is nothing out of bounds anymore. If you could dream it up and talk to a crew of people, you can put it on screen, and it's something that, you know, budget and time would have held us back in the past. We would have had to find shortcuts, but it's technology has caught up with ambition, and it's really exciting.
I love when you talk about how many dragons you could put on screen in the first film versus the third film. What are the numbers?
Yeah, it was, we had a problem having just a couple of characters on screen in the first movie, and literally the systems would shut down and things would crash. And now I think we had something like 42,000 dragons in the hidden world, and flying alongside Hiccup and Astrid, those little dragons. So it's and that whole environment in the past we would have had to done as matte paintings, but in this movie we were able to construct the entire thing in virtual space and give it all its texture and lighting. So it, you know, on the movie with limited screen time, you only get to explore a small amount of it, but that whole space exists.
Yeah, there's like 1,200 waterfalls, I think, in the hidden world, and originally there was going to be 2 major sequences that took place in the hidden world. And in the course of the story reels and sort of refining the story, you know, we decided that really we only wanted the one scene there, and I thought POV, our production designer, I remember Dean and I having the conversation to say, who's going to break it to POV, that we're going to cut a whole sequence in this incredible environment that was designed, and all the time and technology we put into it, but story comes first, right?
And sorry, to the back part of your question was, what we call the uncanny valley. We're always very conscious of it. We never want to make things too photorealistic. So we always found a balance between retaining a certain caricature in the design of the characters, their faces. Certainly the dragons are kind of a whimsical design. But we put them in environments that were naturalistic but larger than life. Everything was sort of constructed to make Hiccup feel small in his world in the beginning. And the textures, the fur, the moss, everything else is rendered with kind of a realism and naturalism that brings it to life. And with Roger Deakins in the mix, who is our consulting cinematographer on all 3 films, he brought this incredible sort of subtlety and live action sensibility to the mix that took it away from what was the traditional animation look, where everything's kind of candy colored and glossy, and set it somewhere between the world of animation and the world of live action, where there was a sense of naturalistic light and weather patterns moving through, and damp rocks and stones from a passing rainstorm, and all of this came about in a way that was driven by Roger's sensibility. So we were referring to movies that he had done, like The Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford, or Jarhead, or The Village, or something, and we would pin up images and say, how do we get to that look, but in our world? And it was a steady, partnership between our art team and our production designer and our head of visual effects to try to create this lighting look that was quite unique.
But I think also it gave, from what we talked about at the beginning, it gave everything stakes. I mean, I think it was part of what Hiccup was having to deal with, and his village and just the world was just, it was a tough place to live. It was a tough existence there. And I think that, it was believable and that there was a believability to it, but it definitely gave the whole thing a level of stakes that I think was important to storytelling.
It's a really good point, because we wanted the peril to feel real. So unlike a lot of cartoon conventions, if a character were to fall off the back of a dragon, they wouldn't bounce. They would die. If they got in the way of dragon fire, they'd get burnt and probably die. And so it was important to establish a sense of stakes and peril. This is a world where a character can lose a limb and a parent, and so it had to be established early on, and a big part of the design of the world supported that.
A couple more questions before I throw it out to the audience. While I was watching this, I was thinking to myself, what were the animals that inspired you as far as movement goes with the dragon? I mean, obviously the dragon, but I mean, like the way Toothless would move, it was almost like a lion. I mean, I was wondering if you could talk about that, the animals that inspired.
Sure. So when Chris Sanders and I first joined the first movie, How to Train Your Dragon, a lot of the designs had already been modeled into articulated characters that animators could work with, and they were all very reptilian. So we decided we brought changes to the story. One of the big changes was Toothless. Toothless from the books is a small talking dog-sized dragon. And he's actually the terrible terrors in the movie, the little seagull-like dragons that flock around Toothless. But Toothless, as a reinvention, as a character that if Hiccup was going to befriend a dragon, it should be a potent one. It should be something that Vikings fear. And so we were looking at different designs, and one day we walked across, there was a storyboard artist who had a Black Panther image on her monitor, and it was draped across a tree limb, and it was so elegant but so dangerous. And we thought, we don't have any mammalian qualities in any of these dragons. So that became a key design element. We thought, let's reference that big cat movement and combine it with the idea of a salamander. And that's really why Toothless kind of stands out from a lot of the other dragon designs. So we referenced, we spent a lot of time looking at YouTube animal videos and cute things that cats and dogs do. I have French bulldogs, so there's a little bit of that in his behavior as well. With the Light Fury, we leaned far more into the feline quality. We studied snow leopards and lioness and just sort of that graceful feline movement. But yeah, every dragon has a different reference point. So the Gronkles are sort of based on walruses. Valka's dragon, Cloudjumper, is kind of based on an owl's mannerisms. Usually a combination of things as well.
Stormfly is very dragon-like. What is it?
But she's a parrot.
She's a parrot.
Yeah, sort of curious and that bird-like parrot movement. Yeah.
He has an answer for everything. I asked all the questions.
And then we can't forget John Powell's score. Was nominated the first one was nominated for Best Original Score. Tell me about it. It's like an old-fashioned epic. It reminds me of a David Lean movie where it's like wall-to-wall score. It's something that, some filmmaker, it's rare, I think, nowadays that we have a wall-to-wall score. Tell me about that and the music and how it itself as a character.
We could all speak to that. I mean, John, I think the greatest compliment came from the orchestra. So many members of the orchestra, while we were recording in Abbey Road, would say we love working for John because he writes for the whole orchestra. And yeah, it's spellbinding to be there when they play that cue for the first time, with all of its flaws that none of us are able to detect. But John will get on and just be able to, oboe number 4, you're off by half a note on the it's really incredible. But John John's a storyteller in his own right, and like America and Jay, I would share the script with him quite early on, and he would come back with ideas, but mostly he would start locking into themes that aren't necessarily the themes I was trying to push forward. They're almost like harmonies. And for example, in the second movie, I was saying, well, it's about this kid who's trying to find himself against the backdrop of two very domineering parents with very opinionated philosophies about the world. And he said, oh, really? I think it's about lost and found. Every character is lost and finding either themselves or one another. And that's the score he wrote. And so in moments where I thought there would be, oh, it's an action scene, it's going to have, driving, pounding action, and I'm, pulling out like Conan the Barbarian as references, he would play something that was kind of melancholic and underscoring a sadness or like a foreshadowing of something that's unraveling between the characters. And I always thought that was so brilliant because it really does elevate what we were doing. And once that temporary score is replaced with the real one, it feels like it's half of the storytelling that comes into the mix.
I just want to say, I just think it's such an amazing experience to have these creative collaborators be part of all three films. From amazing voice cast to our crew and great people we worked with, to the John Powells and Roger Deakins and Randy Tom, our sound designer, were part of all three films. And I think if you go back and watch all three of them, you'll just see that there's these things that just connect these in such a great way. And I think Dean's aspiration to make this about the coming of age of Hiccup and Toothless, and these three films to tell this story are just a great example of how all these people work together for more than a decade, a lot of us, to kind of bring them to the screen. We're all so proud of them, I have to say.
Brad and Bonnie, take us a little bit into the production process up close with an animated film like this. Let's say over a month, over either a 2-week period or a month. How many different teams are working on different sequences in the film? Like, you got the Hidden World team over there on that side, and they're working on that sequence, and then somebody's working on the beginning. How does it work?
So we don't really have separate teams working on separate areas of the movie. Certainly there's a certain amount of setup that goes in. So there is a part of the effects team is working on what's going to happen in the hidden world ahead of time, and they're very specifically trying to solve the problems for that particular scene. But for the crew, let's say we have 200 people, we're really just sort of we break the movie up into sequences of maybe there's 40 of them that last 3 to 5 minutes each, where the different action and some of the drama takes place. And we just we put those into production, and they sort of overlap. They have like a 16-week life from the beginning of production to the end of production, and they're all sort of overlapping as they go through. So, we try to do those for how they work best for each one of those departments. Animation, we have leads on some of the different characters, because there's certain animators that are really the heart and soul of given characters, and they really know how to sort of dispel the magic to the team of what they have on each one of them. But that's essentially the way that we do it.
We try to space out the hardest sequences over the course of the movie, just to try to, so that it all doesn't pile up in the end. But, there's sometimes a method to our madness. Sometimes we get foiled, right, Brad?
Is there a very, very, very early on a beta version of the film that's constructed, kind of like a sloppy kind of brick of black,
I think that's the greatest thing about animation, really, is that you edit your movie first before you shoot it, so to speak. So it starts with the story reel process.
Right, so it's like not sloppy at all, right? It literally, the most of the money, frankly, is in the labor in animation, so we don't put things in willy-nilly. I think we like nothing to be on the cutting room floor at the end. Dean works tirelessly on a story reel. We work tirelessly together with him to make that really tight and really work. We have the final voices from the actors before they're animated, and so they go in very precisely into the process, so that it's done in such a way that it's exactly what Dean wants, and then every step along the way pluses it. We see it animated, it blows our mind. We see it lit, and so it's get texture and light and everything, it blows our mind.
And those pieces just keep getting cut into that story reel, and so that becomes the movie as things get finished. And We're constantly looking at it and re-looking at it along the way.
Yeah, and just to clarify for people in the room, if you might not know, a story reel is a mock-up of the movie. We have storyboard artists who will work off of the pages that I write, and in a very detailed way with all sorts of expressions and just lots of filler drawings, provide storyboards to our editor. And he'll cut them together with temporary sound, temporary music, and even temporary voices. Like we'll provide the voices in the beginning, which is all very embarrassing. But we put together a close to the running time of the movie mock-up that we can watch, and even though the images are still, we're getting a sense of how it's playing. Is it funny? Is it engaging? Is it confusing? Is it boring? And I'll go back and rewrite moments that need to be rewritten. But that's the way we test it, and we will screen that story reel version for our internal executives. And as they said, as we start animation, we'll replace those scenes individually with the animation as it starts to go through the process. So oftentimes, if you've ever been in one of these test screenings, you'll see that there are a whole lot of storyboard, black and white, sketchy storyboard sequences that are still standing in for moments that are making their way through the production process.
Let's open it up to you. Yes.
I have a list of questions from my niece. But I see two that are, and I don't know who can speak to them, but two that seem to be very important. Does Light Fury have a name? And why was it so easy to kill Grimmel?
Well, I'll start with the Light Fury. So we deliberately did not give her a name because we wanted her to remain wild. All of the other dragons that were domesticated, that were brought into the village with the dragons, they had become part of the Viking community, and therefore they had their individual names. Light Fury was deliberately brought in as a character who would lure Toothless in a charming and innocent way back to the world he came from. And by giving her a name, it felt like we were sort of branding her as one of the human's own. And so that's why we've been asked many times, especially by the merchandising department, to give her a name for the toys. So you could tell her to name her herself, but the intention was to avoid it. As far as Grimmel, why was he easily killed? Well, I guess I didn't.
Well, Hiccup had to lose his leg in order to kill him.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely wanted it to be a 1-2. This Light Fury that had been rejecting Hiccup throughout the movie finally comes to his aid, and in that moment, Hiccup puts 2 and 2 together and thinks, if I just get rid of this last appendage of mine, I can dump Grimmel. And they were falling at a pretty high speed, so hitting the ocean at that velocity, I don't think anyone would survive it. But I'm sorry if she felt like it was too easy.
Reality plays a big part then.
Yes.
Another yes.
It's a two-part question for you, Dean, in America. For you, Dean, it's regarding from the time from casting, obviously, what's the quality you were looking for? And then you mentioned you start shaping the part toward the actors that you cast, right?
Yes.
I would like to hear a little bit about that, and also how do you work with the performance in the studio? And for America, is your process different than narrative compared to animation? Those are 2 questions. And thank you for asking this about that. I'm proud of that.
Agreed. So when Chris Andrews and I joined the movie, we were a replacement set of writers and directors, and a lot of the cast was already in place. There were only a few characters that were left to be cast. Gobber, who we cast as Craig Ferguson, and that was on the first movie. I'm trying to think of who else. But we met America, we met Jay, we met all of the other cast that had already been brought in, and I mean, it was like, what a dream, that all the work had been done. They'd already said yes, and they'd already started to get to know their characters a little bit. So they were instrumental in reshaping them according to the story changes that Chris and I were making. And they became, touchstones for how those characters think. So I credit America and Jay and the other cast members for being as much the creators of their characters as we were.
It's a really different process. and a little bit daunting, and one that I feel like I had to get used to, and also because there years go by in between each film. Jay and I both voiced our characters in, was it 5 seasons of the TV series? There's a TV series in between, and so we would, kind of stay a little bit warmed up because we were doing that, but in the films, years would go by. So coming back, years would go by, and then in the life of the film and in the life of the characters, years would go by. So we'd come back and be like, oh, well, Astrid's aged 5 years, and so like, what does she sound like now, and how is this different? I felt very daunted by it, and I just felt like Jay and so many of the rest of the cast were so natural to it, and I felt like I hadn't realized how much I leaned on my face and body to act, and that really acting through the voice is a different process and does require a different attention, and there were a lot of times where I felt really awkward about it. And I would say probably most recording sessions I would come in feeling awkward, and over the course of being directed by Dean, over the course of getting back into Astrid's mannerisms and getting into her story, would I feel like, okay, this feels a little bit less like a baby giraffe learning to walk. So yeah, and the process was such a beautiful one. I mean, I feel so lucky because this is the one experience I've had is working with top-notch filmmakers, but being directed by Dean was such a joy, and there are moments where I remember him directing. As actors, like we're not, it's not like ADR. We're not watching, the animation and then, voicing to the animation. Like, we're staring at Dean's face. and Dean always was kind of giving us the, catching us up, reminding us like where we were in the sequence, what he was looking for. He would sometimes voice some of the other characters and really kind of narrate me into this world. And I'll never ever forget the feeling. It feels like something I almost experienced. It feels like, remember that day on set when I flew into the sky on Toothless? Like, it was that visceral that I remember when he was talking me through the first time, in the first movie, the first time Astrid gets on Toothless's back and goes for that ride, and how she's freaked out and screaming and getting off this thing, and then the way that he described the moment where we ascend above the clouds and Astrid stops screaming and looks around her and gasps in awe. And I remember like tears coming to my eyes when he was just explaining it and describing it, and so there were so many beautiful moments like that where I got to be on the receiving end of such beautiful storytelling and such amazing directing that had been so inhabited by him, that I felt like every time I stepped into the recording studio, I could trust that Dean was going to kind of lead me back down into like the deliciousness of that world. And so it was very different from acting, but it was really beautiful and surprising in so many ways.
Was it easier when some of the scenes she recorded with Jay in the room, were those any easier or more challenging, you think? I'm just curious.
I mean, easier in the sense that, yeah, you have someone to play off of, but we still kind of had to pause and not talk over each other's lines. And also Jay he's such a natural, like he's such a good voice actor. And
he did it when he was a kid, didn't
conveys,
he?
Like he'd had a lot of experience doing it. So
He's the complete opposite. He actually hates interacting with live people. he would always rather, he voiced a lot of, he used to do overdubs for French cartoons when he was a little kid.
That's funny.
And he's just so much more comfortable in a booth with nobody around him.
yeah.
But if he has to be around, set people and other actors, he gets really this high anxiety. So
I think the best Astrid and Hiccup scenes were the ones you guys did together. I
Yeah,
thought they were
yeah,
really
yeah.
emotional and
Yeah.
very. I could sort of tell when they were done together. They just feel more special.
Yeah. I would just always come in and not know what to do with my hands, until, Dean, got me back on solid ground.
I mean, it's on all movies I've worked on, the actors, it's really hard for them to, they completely, it's different than everything that they're really used to, right? They don't go through the process of learning the lines in advance necessarily. They don't go through the process of costume, makeup, all these things that they're used to. Reacting to another actor, being on set, whatever it is, and suddenly we have to help stimulate their imagination entirely, and also trust that this process where they might record 8 to 10 times over the course of 2 years, like sort of help with the continuity and get back into a place, because an actor gives us their heart and soul, and we have to do the right thing with it. So
I think stand-up people do really good at it, actually. People that do stand-up
comedians,
comedy.
they can pop
I
into that
think you
world.
nailed it. It's a practice of imagination. Like, it's all about imagination, and I feel like I could only really get there and feel like I was doing Astrid justice when that imagination was activated. And because a lot of acting in front of green screen is hard, because you're like, well, I'm cold, I'm acting cold, it's hard. And then to be in a sound booth with no actors and nothing, it's like a lot relies on this guy right here, directing you, and as you say so beautifully, activating that imagination and playing.
even worse for the actors is that when they do get into the moment and they're really experiencing it, either the fear or if it's an action scene and they have to be physical or whatever it is, they naturally are going to use their bodies, and they're naturally going to kind of imagine and react to what they see happening around them. And we keep having to stop them and saying, okay, but do it to the mic, because the mic is fixed, so they can't even move their heads like this. They have to deliver all of that. They have to imagine the physicality and not move their heads away from the microphone.
And that was a great take, but they're 30 feet away, so do the same thing just like that. Project it.
And for you, watching yourself for the first time, was that interesting?
Watching it for the first time is hard. Actually, watching it always is hard. For me to watch myself, every other character feels so real. Every character is like, that never existed without Jay's voice. That never existed without Gerard or whoever. And with the one Astrid, I'm like, oh, this is so embarrassing. Like that's my voice. I'm disembodied. That is not it's very, very hard to. It's like listening to a voice.
She has
machine.
blonde hair.
But the beauty of it is, as an actor, you are, one piece of, as you have heard, a 200-person crew creating a world around something you did in a sound booth a year before. And so I'll never forget, we got to go to Cannes with the second film and watch the second film at Cannes, and Jay and I were the loudest people in the theater, laughing and hooting and hollering. I mean, we're the biggest fans, but it's every child's dream. There's this amazing, magnificent world on this big screen in front of you, and you're in it! It's like the coolest thing ever. It really does feel like being, like I won a contest, and I'm a very small part of something massively amazing and bigger than me.
I think one of the things that the actors often have a moment of pause with is just they're giving the vocal performance, but then it goes into the hands of these animators who listen to it over and over again, and then they invent the physicality of it. And so the expressions, the mannerisms, the little head ticks, all of these gestures that to them feel natural based on the vocal performance they're hearing. But often when the actors later see the animation, I wouldn't move like that, or I wouldn't make that expression. So it is a little strange to connect the two.
One more question? Yes, in the back.
I was wondering if you could talk about the design of the hidden world itself, which is stunning, and if you had points of reference in the real world from other stories and how you came up with what would be in it and what it would look like.
Sure, great. So the hidden world came about from the first image was from a dream I had, and it was a hole in the sea. It was about a gaping mile-wide hole in the sea, a 360-degree Niagara Falls pouring into who knows what. And as we were talking about this idea of an ancestral home of dragons, one that Toothless would return to along with the rest of it at the end of the movie, we knew that we didn't want it to feel like a banishment. So it shouldn't be dark and dreary. It shouldn't just be volcanic and red and awful. We had seen those sorts of dragon nests in the previous films. So we thought it should be a world unto itself, something that kind of spreads like spider webs beneath the crust of the earth that goes the whole globe around, that had different access points, and this hole in the sea could be one of them. But as we descend into it, we also didn't want it to feel like we jumped into a different dimension, or we were suddenly on a different planet. So Pierre-Olivier Vincent, who is our production designer, we call him POV, and his art team did a lot of research into bioluminescence and phosphorescence and naturally occurring phenomenon in this world, like glowworm caves in New Zealand. And they started to piece together these ideas of how do we bring light into this space. We could have tunnels that would open up into vast chambers, but we wanted it to feel kind of magical. So we thought all of this ocean water that would be pouring into live magma veins would create a really salty, wet atmosphere, and maybe coral would grow midair. We could have all sorts of fungi that would be bioluminescent, and maybe in flying through those passages, the dragons themselves would unveil kind of like black light patterns, which would make it extra cool. And then when we got into the massive chamber where Toothless is being heralded as the alpha, we wanted to light it with a different scheme, and so we thought, how about geode crystal, like massive crystals carrying light from magma veins that would infuse it with sort of a reddish glow. So there's definitely like a fanciful, whimsical take on what is naturally occurring phenomenon in this world, and that helped to ground it a little bit.
Excellent. So is this really the end? I mean, or do you think we could see there's more?
No, I think it is the end. This is the bullseye that we painted for ourselves at the end of the movie. At the outset, and we achieved it. And even with all of the changes that have happened through the years, we managed to just kind of stick our landing, and we're all very proud of that. And it's a bittersweet thing for us because we've become family over the course of these 10 years. It's largely the same crew, and so we've disbanded and we're working on different films, some at different studios. We may never be assembled again in the same way, but as the characters say goodbye to one another in the movie, we've said goodbye to not only the characters but one another, and it's both, it's bittersweet because you want to hold on to that memory, but it's also a 10-year feather in our caps. We're very proud of the work we did, and now we're very excited about what's next. I think the story reached its conclusion.
I know you're working on a number of live action projects, but do you think you'll ever return to animation down the road?
Of course, yeah. In fact, I'm slow developing a live action project for DreamWorks right now. So it's I love animation. I'll always come back to it, but it takes time, and this just seems like an opportunity at this point in my life to jump into a few live action projects and see if I can bring them to fruition.
And then the last question's from my son, and I think I know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask anyway. He was under the impression that Drago was going to come back in this third chapter, and he was wondering, was that so? And if so, why was that not realized?
Your son is astute. Yes. So originally, Drago was meant to return in the third movie, having survived that conflict of the second film and having washed ashore with Flotsam to some desert island, which turns out was not deserted at all. It was home to a really aggressive, very territorial dragon. And so in order to survive and get back to claim his place at the head of his army, he had to befriend this creature. And in so doing, it was like a really sort of tit-for-tat struggle of the minds and strong wills, but they came to kind of a moment of communion, and it changed Drago. He developed a respect for these creatures. And as he flew into the battle of the third act to take his place at the head of his army, he landed on the side of the dragon riders and suddenly was fighting alongside them. And it was kind of a moment of redemption despite his heinous crimes. And it was kind of a tough thing because he's a hard character to forgive, but I wanted to give him dimension because admittedly in the second film he's a bit of a one-dimensional character. And it was actually Steven Spielberg who, on an early screening, and he was a gracious resource to us throughout all three films, but he said, I don't think you have the time, the screen time, to really do that storyline justice. It's going to rob too much from the Hiccup and Astrid and Toothless story. So, I would advise you set it aside and focus on that because that's really where the audience is going to be concentrating their attention. And I think it was wise, given, this is animation, we have a 90-minute screen time and not much more. So it was wise, but it almost deserves its own storyline because it was kind of left a little ambiguous at the end of the second movie.
So tell your son it was Steven Spielberg's fault.
Excellent. Ladies and gentlemen, How to Train Your Dragon.
Thank you for coming, guys.
Thank you very much.